Part 9. What is noble? Every elevation of the type man has hitherto been the work of an aristocratic society, and so it will always be. A society which believes in a long scale of orders of rank and differences of worth between man, and needs slavery in some sense or other. Without the pathos of distance, such as develops from the incarnate differences of classes, from the ruling caste's constant looking out and looking down on subjects and instruments, and from its equally constant exercise of obedience and command, its holding down and holding at a distance, that other. As to how an aristocratic society, that is to say, the precondition for this elevation of the type man, originates, one ought not to yield to any humanitarian illusions. Truth is hard. Let us admit to ourselves, unflinchingly, how every higher culture on earth has hitherto begun. Men of a still natural nature, barbarians in every fearful sense of the word, men of praise still in possession of an unbroken strength of will and lust for power, threw themselves upon weaker, more civilized, more peaceful, perhaps trading or cattle-raising races, or upon old mellow cultures, the laws. The noble caste was in the beginning always the barbarian caste. Their superiority lay, not in their physical strength, but primarily in their psychical. They were more complete human beings, which, on every level, also means as much as more complete beasts. Corruption as the indication that anarchy threatens within the instincts, and that the foundation of the emotions which is called life has been shaken. Corruption is something fundamentally different according to which life form it appears in. When, for example, an aristocracy such as that of France at the start of the Revolution throws away its privileges with a sublime disgust and sacrifices itself to an excess of moral feeling, then that is corruption. It was really only the closing act of that corruption which had been going on for C. The essential thing in a good and healthy aristocracy is, however, that it does not feel itself to be a function of the monarchy or of the commonwealth, but as their meaning and supreme justification, that it therefore accepts with a good conscience the sacrifice of innumerable men who for its sake. Its fundamental faith must be that society should not exist for the sake of society, but only as foundation and scaffolding upon which a select species of being is able to raise itself to its higher task, and in general to a higher existence. Like those sun-seeking climbing plants of Java, they are N. To refrain from mutual injury, mutual violence, mutual exploitation, to equate one's own will with that of another. This may in a certain rough sense become good manners between individuals if the conditions for it are present, namely if their strength and value standards are in fact similar, and t. As soon as there is a desire to take this principle further, however, and if possible even as the fundamental principle of society, it at once reveals itself for what it is, as the will to the denial of life, as the principle of dissolution and decay. One has to think this matter thoroughly through to the bottom and resist all sentimental weakness. Life itself is essentially appropriation, injury, overpowering of the strange and weaker, suppression, severity, imposition of one's own forms, incorporation, and, at the least and mildest, exploitation. Even that body within which, as was previously assumed, individuals treat one another as equals, this happens in every healthy aristocracy, must, if it is a living and not a decaying body, itself do all that to other bodies which the individuals within it refrain from doing to one another. It will. On no point, however, is the common European consciousness more reluctant to learn than it is here. Everywhere one enthuses, even under scientific disguises, about coming states of society in which there will be no more exploitation. That sounds to my ears like promising a life in which there will. Exploitation does not pertain to a corrupt or imperfect or primitive society. It pertains to the essence of the living thing as a fundamental organic function. It is a consequence of the intrinsic will to power which is precisely the will of life. Granted, this is a novelty as a theory. As a reality, it is the primordial fact of all history. Let us be at least that honest with ourselves. In a tour of the many finer and coarser moralities which have ruled or still rule on earth, I found certain traits regularly recurring together and bound up with one another, until at length 2 basic types were revealed, and a basic distinction emerged. There is master morality and slave morality. I add at once that in all higher and mixed cultures, attempts at mediation between the two are apparent, and more frequently confusion and mutual misunderstanding between them. Indeed, sometimes their harsh juxtaposition, even within the same man, within O. The moral value distinctions have arisen either among a ruling order which was pleasurably conscious of its distinction from the ruled, or among the ruled, the slaves and dependents of every degree. In the former case, when it is the rulers who determine the concept, good, it is the exalted, proud states of soul which are considered distinguishing and determine the order of rank. The noble human being separates from himself those natures in which the opposite of such exalted, proud states find expression. He despises them. It should be noted at once that in this first type of morality the antithesis, good and bad, means the same thing as noble and despicable. The antithesis, good and evil, originates elsewhere. The cowardly, the timid, the petty, and those who think only of narrow utility are despised, as are the mistrustful with their constricted glance, those who abase themselves, the dog-like type of man who lets himself be mistreated, the fawning flatterer above all the liar. It is a fundamental belief. We who are truthful, thus did the nobility of ancient Greece designate themselves. It is immediately obvious that designations of moral value were everywhere first applied to human beings, and only later and derivatively to actions, which is why it is a grave error when moral historians start from such questions as why has the compassionate action been praised? The noble type of. Everything he knows to be part of himself, he honors. Such a morality is self-glorification. In the foreground stands the feeling of plenitude, of power which seeks to overflow, the happiness of high tension, the consciousness of a wealth which would like to give away and bestow. The noble human being too aids the unfortunate, but not, or almost not, from pity, but more from an urge begot. The noble human being honors in himself the man of power, also the man who has power over himself, who understands how to speak and how to keep silent, who enjoys practicing severity and harshness upon himself, and feels reverence for all that is severe and harsh. A hard heart has Wotan set in my breast. It says in an old Scandinavian saga, a just expression coming from the soul of a proud Viking. A man of this type is actually proud that he is not made for pity, which is why the hero of the saga adds as a warning, he whose heart is not hard in youth will never have a hard heart. Brave and noble men who think that are at the farthest remove from that morality, which sees the mark of the moral precisely in pity, or in acting for others, or in désinteressement, belief in oneself, pride in oneself, a fundamental hostility and irony for selflessness, belong just as definitely to N. It is the powerful who understand how to honor, that is their art, their realm of invention. Deep reverence for age and the traditional, all law rests on this twofold reverence, belief in and prejudice in favor of ancestors and against descendants, is typical of the morality of the powerful, and when, conversely, men of modern ideas believe almost instinctively in progress, and the F. A morality of the rulers is, however, most alien and painful to contemporary taste, in the severity of its principle that one has duties only towards one's equals, that towards beings of a lower rank, towards everything alien, one may act as one wishes or as the heart dictates, and in any case bea. The capacity for and the duty of protracted gratitude and protracted revenge, both only among one's equals subtlety and requital, a refined conception of friendship, a certain need to have enemies as conduit systems, as it were, for the emotions of envy, quarrelsomeness, arrogance, fundamental. It is otherwise with the second type of morality, slave morality. Suppose the abused, oppressed, suffering, unfree, those uncertain of themselves and weary should moralize. What would their moral evaluations have in common? Probably a pessimistic mistrust of the entire situation of man will find expression, perhaps a condemnation of man together with his situation. The slave is suspicious of the virtues of the powerful. He is skeptical and mistrustful, keenly mistrustful, of everything good, that is honored among them. He would like to convince himself that happiness itself is not genuine among them. On the other hand, those qualities which serve to make easier the existence of the suffering will be brought into prominence and flooded with light. Here it is that pity, the kind and helping hand, the warm heart, patience, industriousness, humility, friendliness come into honor, for here these are. Slave morality is essentially the morality of utility. Here is the source of the famous antithesis: good and evil. Power and danger were felt to exist in evil, a certain dreadfulness, subtlety and strength which could not admit of contempt. Thus, according to slave morality, the evil inspire fear. According to master morality, it is precisely the good who inspire fear and want to inspire it, while the bad man is judged contemptible. The antithesis reaches its height when, consistently with slave morality, a breath of disdain finally also comes to be attached to the good of this morality. It may be a slight and benevolent disdain, because within the slave's way of thinking the good man has in any event to be a harmless man. Wherever slave morality comes to predominate, language exhibits a tendency to bring the words good and stupid closer to each other. A final fundamental distinction: the longing for freedom, the instinct for the happiness and the refinements of the feeling of freedom, belong just as necessarily to slave morality and morals as the art of reverence and devotion, and the enthusiasm for them are the regular symptom of an aristocracy. This makes it clear without further ado why love as passion, it is our European speciality, absolutely must be of aristocratic origin. It was, as is well known, invented by the poet knights of Provence, those splendid, inventive men of the Guy sabre to whom Europe owes so much, and indeed Among the things which a noble human being perhaps finds hardest to understand is vanity. He will be tempted to deny its existence, where a different type of human being will think it palpably evident. For him, the problem is to imagine creatures who try to awaken a good opinion of themselves which they themselves do not hold, and thus do not deserve either, and yet subsequently come to believe this good opinion themselves. This seems to him in part so tasteless and lacking in self-respect, and in part so baroquely irrational that he would prefer to consider vanity exceptional, and in most cases where it is spoken of he doubts its existence. He will say, for example, "I can rate my value incorrectly and yet demand that others too should recognize my value exactly as I rate it, but that is not vanity, but self-conceit, or more usually what is called humility or modesty." Or he will say, "I can, for many reasons, take pleasure in." It can be conceived as the consequence of a tremendous atavism that even now the ordinary man still always waits for an opinion about himself, and then instinctively submits to it. But this happens not merely in the case of a good opinion, but also in that of a bad and unfair one. Consider, for instance. Now it is a fact that, in accordance with the slow rise of the democratic order of things, and its cause, the mixing of the blood of masters and slaves, the originally noble and rare impulse to ascribe a value to oneself on one's own account, and to think well of oneself will be increasingly encou. The vain man takes pleasure in every good opinion he hears about himself, quite apart from any point of view of utility, and likewise regardless of truth or falsehood, just as he suffers from every bad opinion, for he submits to both. He feels subject to them from that oldest instinct of subjection. It is the slave in the vain man's blood, a remnant of the craftiness of the slave, and how much slave still remains in woman, for example, which seeks to seduce him to good opinions about himself. It is likewise the slave who immediately afterwards falls down before these opinions as if he himself had not called them forth. And to say it again, vanity is an atavism. A species arises, a type becomes fixed and strong, through protracted struggle against essentially constant unfavorable conditions. Conversely, one knows from the experience of breeders that species which receive plentiful nourishment and an excess of care and protection soon tend very strongly to produce variations of their type and are rich in marvels and monstrosities, also in monstrous vices. Now look for once at an aristocratic community, Venice, say, or an ancient Greek polis, as a voluntary or involuntary contrivance for the purpose of breeding. There are human beings living together and thrown on their own resources who want their species to prevail usually, because they have to. Here those favorable conditions, that excess, that protection which favors variations, is lacking. The species needs itself as species, as something that can prevail and purchase durability in its continual struggle against its neighbors or against the oppressed in revolt or threatening revolt. P. The most manifold experience teaches it which qualities it has principally to thank that, in spite of all gods and men, it still exists and has always been victorious. These qualities it calls virtues. These virtues alone does it breed and cultivate. It does so with severity. Indeed, it wants severity. Every aristocratic morality is intolerant in the education of the young, in the measures it takes with respect to women, in marriage customs, in the relations between young and old, in the penal laws, which are directed only at variance. It can. A type with few but very marked traits, a species of stern, warlike, prudently silent, determined and taciturn men, and as such, men of the finest feeling for the charm and nuances of society, is in this way firmly fixed beyond the changes of generations, continual struggle against ever-constant you. In the end, however, there arises one day an easier state of affairs, and the tremendous tension relaxes. Perhaps there are no longer any enemies among their neighbors, and the means of life, even for the enjoyment of life, are there in plenty. With one stroke the bond and constraint of the ancient discipline is broken. It is no longer felt to be a necessity, a condition of existence. If it were to persist, it could be only as a form of luxury, as an archaizing taste. Variation, whether as deviation into the higher, rarer, more refined, or as degeneration and monstrosity, is suddenly on the scene in the greatest splendor and abundance. The individual dares to be individual and stand out. At these turning points of history, there appear side by side, and often entangled and entwined together, a glorious, manifold, jungle-like growth and upstirring, a kind of tropical tempo in competition in growing, and a tremendous perishing and self-destruction, thanks to the savage egoisms which tour. It was this morality which stored up such enormous energy, which bent the bow in such a threatening manner. Now it is spent. Now it is becoming outlived. The dangerous and uncanny point is reached where the grander, more manifold, more comprehensive life lives beyond the old morality. The individual stands there, reduced to his own law-giving, to his own arts and stratagems for self-preservation, self-enhancement, self-redemption. Nothing but new whys and wherewithals, no longer any common formulas, misunderstanding in alliance with disrespect, decay, corruption, and the highest desires horribly tangled together. The genius of the race overflowing out of every cornucopia of good and bad, spring and autumn falling fatally to. Danger is again present, the mother of morality, great danger. Only this time it comes from the individual, from neighbor and friend, from the street, from one's own child, from one's own heart, from the most personal and secret recesses of wish and will. What will the moral philosophers who come you? They discover, these acute observers and idlers, that the end is fast approaching, that everything around them is corrupt and corrupting, that nothing can last beyond the day after tomorrow, one species of man excepted, the incurably mediocre. The mediocre alone have the prospect of continuing on and propagating themselves. They are the men of the future, the sole survivors. Be like them. Become mediocre is henceforth the only morality that has any meaning left, that still finds ears to hear it. But it is difficult to preach, this morality of mediocrity. For it can never admit what it is and what it wants. It has to speak of moderation and dignity and duty and love of one's neighbor. It will scarcely be able to conceal its irony. There is an instinct for rank which is more than anything else already the sign of a high rank. There is a delight in the nuances of reverence, which reveals a noble origin and noble habits. The refinement, goodness, and loftiness of a soul is put to a perilous test whenever something passes before it that is of the first rank, but not yet protected from importunate clumsiness and claws by the awe of authority. something that goes its way unsignalized, undiscovered, tempting perhaps arby. He whose task and practice it is to explore the soul will avail himself of precisely this art, in many forms, in order to determine the ultimate value of a soul, the unalterable innate order of rank to which it belongs. He will test it for its instinct of reverence. Difference engender hain. The commonness of some natures suddenly spurts up like dirty water whenever some sacred vessel, some precious object from a closed shrine, some book with the marks of a great destiny is carried by. And on the other hand, there is an involuntary falling silent, a hesitation. The way in which reverence for the Bible has hitherto been generally maintained in Europe is perhaps the best piece of discipline and refinement of manners that Europe owes to Christianity. Such books of profundity and ultimate significance require for their protection an external tyranny of authority. Much has been gained when the feeling has at last been instilled into the masses, into the shallow pates and greedy guts of every sort, that there are things they must not touch, that there are holy experiences before which they have to take off their shoes and keep their unclean hands away. It is. Conversely, there is perhaps nothing about the so-called cultured, the believers in modern ideas, that arouses so much disgust as their lack of shame, the self-satisfied insolence of eye and hand with which they touch, lick and fumble with everything. And it is possible that more relative nobility, that which his ancestors most liked to do and most constantly did, cannot be erased from a man's soul. Whether, for instance, they were diligent savers and the accessories of a desk and cash box, modest and bourgeois in their desires, modest also in their virtues, or whether they lived accustomed to. It is quite impossible that a man should not have in his body the qualities and preferences of his parents and forefathers, whatever appearances may say to the contrary. This constitutes the problem of race. If one knows something about the parents, it is permissible to draw a conclusion about the child. Any sort of untoward intemperance, any sort of narrow enviousness, a clumsy, obstinate self-assertiveness, these three things together have at all times constituted the characteristics of the plebeian tea. And what else is the objective of education and culture today? In our very democratic, that is to say plebeian age, education and culture have to be in essence the art of deceiving with regard to origins, to the inherited plebeian in soul and body. An educator who today preached truthfulness above all and continually cried to his pupils, "Be true. Be natural. Give yourselves out for what you are." Even such a virtuous and simple ass would, after a time, learn to reach for that furca of Horace to naturam expeller. With what success? The plebeian usque recurrit. At the risk of annoying innocent ears, I set it down that egoism pertains to the essence of the noble soul. I mean the immovable faith that to a being such as we are other beings have to be subordinate by their nature, and sacrifice themselves to us. The noble soul accepts this fact of its egoism without any question mark, also without feeling any severity, constraint, caprice in it, but rather as something that may be grounded in the primal law of things. If it sought a name for it, it would say it is justice itself. Under certain circumstances which make it hesitate at first, it will admit that there are others with rights equal to its own. As soon as it is clear as to this question of rank, it moves among these its equals, and equal in rights with the same sure modesty and tender reverence as it applies to itse. This refinement and self-limitation in traffic with its equals is one more aspect of its egoism. Every star is such an egoist. It honors itself in them, and in the rights it concedes them. It is in no doubt that the exchange of honors and rights, as the essence of social intercourse, is likewise. The noble soul gives as it takes, out of the passionate and sensitive instinct of requital which lies in its depths. The concept, favor, has no meaning or good odor inter pairs. There may be a sublime way of letting gifts from above as it were befall one, and drinking them up thirstily like drops. But for this sort of behavior, the noble soul has no aptitude. Its egoism hinders it here. It does not like to look up at all. It prefers to look either in front, horizontally and slowly, or down. It knows it is at a height. One can truly respect only him who does not look out for himself. Goethe to Ratschlosser. The Chinese have a proverb which mothers even teach their children. Sin, make your heart small. This is the characteristic basic tendency in late civilizations. I do not doubt that the first thing an ancient Greek would remark in us Europeans of today would also be self-diminution, through T. What ultimately is commonness? Words are sounds designating concepts. Concepts, however, are more or less definite images designating frequently recurring and associated sensations, groups of sensations. To understand one another, it is not sufficient to employ the same words. We have also to employ the same words to designate the same species of inner experiences. We must ultimately have our experience in common. That is why the members of one people understand one another better than do members of differing peoples even when they use the same language. Or rather, when human beings have lived together for a long time under similar conditions of climate, soil, danger, needs, work, there arises from this a G. In every soul in this group, an equivalent number of frequently recurring experiences has gained the upper hand over those which come more rarely. It is on the basis of these that people understand one another, quickly and ever more quickly. The history of language is the history of a process of AB. The greater the danger, the greater is the need to reach agreement quickly and easily as to what has to be done. Not to misunderstand one another in situations of danger is an absolute necessity in human relations. One makes this same test even in the case of friendships or love affairs. Nothing of that sort can last once it is discovered that when one party uses words, he connects them with feelings, intentions, perceptions, desires, fears different from those the other party connects them with. Fear of the eternal misunderstanding. That is the benevolent genius who so often keeps persons of differing sex from over-hasty attachments to which senses and heart prompt them, and not some Schopenhauerian genius of the species. Exactly which groups of sensations are awakened, begin to SP. A human being's evaluations betray something of the structure of his soul, and where it sees its conditions of life, its real needs. Now supposing that need has at all times brought together only such human beings as could indicate similar requirements, similar experiences by means of similar signs, it follows that on the whole the easy communicability of need, that is to say ultimately the experiencing of only average and common. The more similar, more ordinary human beings have had and still have the advantage, the more select, subtle, rare and harder to understand are liable to remain alone, succumb to accidents in their isolation and seldom propagate themselves. Tremendous counterforces have to be called upon to cross this natural, all too natural progressus in simile, the continuing development of mankind into the similar, ordinary, average, herd-like, into the common. The more a psychologist, a born, an unavoidable psychologist and reader of souls, turns his attention to the more select cases and human beings, the greater grows the danger of his suffocating from pity. He needs hardness and cheerfulness more than other men. For the corruption, the ruination of higher human beings, of more strangely constituted souls, is the rule. It is dreadful to have such a rule always before one's eyes. The manifold torment of the psychologist who has discovered this ruination, who discovers this whole inner wretchedness of the higher human being, this eternal too late, in every sense, first once and then almost always throughout the whole of history, may perhaps one day make him turn against. One will perceive in almost every psychologist a telltale preference for, and pleasure in associating with everyday and well-ordered people. This betrays that he is in constant need of a cure, that he requires a kind of flight and forgetting, away from that which his insights and incisions, his trad. It is characteristic of him that he is afraid of his memory. He is easily silenced by the judgment of others. He listens with a straight face when people venerate, admire, love, transfigure where he has seen, or he conceals even his silence by expressly agreeing with some superficial opinion. Perhaps the paradox of his situation is so ghastly that precisely where he has learned great pity together with great contempt the mob, the cultured, the enthusiasts learn great veneration for great men and prodigies on whose account they bless the fatherland, the earth, the dignity o. And who knows whether what has happened hitherto in all great cases has not always been the same thing, that the mob worshipped a god, and that the god was only a poor sacrificial beast. Success has always been the biggest liar, and the work itself a kind of success. The great statesman, the conqueror, the discoverer is disguised by his creations to the point of unrecognizability. The work, that of the artist or the philosopher, invents him who created it, is supposed to have C. Great poets, for example, such as Byron, Musset, Poe, Leopardi, Kleist, Gogol. I do not dare to name greater names, but I mean them, as they are and perhaps have to be. Men of moments, enthusiastic, sensual, childish, sudden and frivolous in trust and mistrust, with souls in which some fracture is. It is so very understandable that they should so easily receive precisely from woman, who is clairvoyante in the world of suffering, and unfortunately also eager to help and save far beyond her power to do so, those outbursts of boundless, most devoted pity which the mob, above all the venerating M. This pity habitually deceives itself about its strength. Woman would like to believe that love can do everything. It is her characteristic faith. Alas, he who knows the heart divines how poor, stupid, helpless, arrogant, blundering, more prone to destroy than save is even the best and deepest love. It is possible that within the holy disguise and fable of Jesus' life, there lies concealed one of the most painful cases of the martyrdom of knowledge about love. The martyrdom of the most innocent and longing heart which never had sufficient of human love, which demanded love, to be loved and not. He whose feelings are like this, he who knows about love to this extent, seeks death. But why reflect on such painful things? As long as one does not have to. The spiritual haughtiness and disgust of every human being who has suffered deeply. How deeply human beings can suffer almost determines their order of rank. The harrowing certainty, with which he is wholly permeated and colored, that by virtue of his suffering he knows more than even the cleave. This spiritual, silent haughtiness of the sufferer, this pride of the elect of knowledge, of the initiated, of the almost sacrificed, finds all forms of disguise necessary to protect itself against contact with importunate and pitying hands, and in general against everything which is not its equal. Profound suffering ennobles, it separates. One of the most subtle forms of disguise is Epicureanism, and a certain ostentatious bravery of taste, which takes suffering frivolously and arms itself against everything sorrowful and profound. There are cheerful people who employ cheerfulness because they are misunderstood on account of it. They want to be misunderstood. There are men of science who employ science because it produces a cheerful appearance, and because scientificality gives the impression a person is superficial. They want to give a false impression. There are free, insolent spirits who would like to conceal and deny that they are broken, proud, incurable hearts, the cynicism of Hamlet, the case of Gallieni. And sometimes folly itself is the mask for an unhappy, all too certain knowledge, from which it follows that it is part of a more refined humanity to have reverence for the mask, and not to practice psychology and inquisitiveness in the wrong place. That which divides two people most profoundly is a differing sense and degree of cleanliness. Of what good is all uprightness and mutual usefulness? Of what good is mutual goodwill? The fact still remains they cannot bear each other's odor. The highest instinct of cleanliness places him who is affected with it in the strangest and most perilous isolation, as a saint, for precisely this. To know an indescribable pleasure in bathing, to feel an ardor and thirst which constantly drives the soul out of night into morning, and out of gloom and gloominess into brightness, into the glittering, profound, refined. Such an inclination is distinguishing. It is a noble inclination, but the saint's pity is pity for the dirt of the human, all too human. And there are degrees and heights at which he feels pity itself as defilement, as dirt. Signs of nobility, never to think of degrading our duties into duties for everybody, not to want to relinquish or share our own responsibilities, to count our privileges and the exercising of them among our duties. A human being who strives for something great regards everybody he meets on his way either as a means or as a delay and hindrance, or as a temporary resting place. The lofty goodness towards his fellow men, which is proper to him, becomes possible only when he has reached his height and he rules. Impatience and his consciousness that until that time he is condemned to comedy. For even war is a comedy and a concealment, just as every means conceals the end, spoil all his association with others. This kind of man knows solitude and what is most poisonous in it. The problem of those who wait, it requires luck and much that is incalculable if a higher human being in whom there slumbers the solution of a problem is to act. Break out, one might say, at the right time. Usually it does not happen, and in every corner of the earth there are people waiting who hardly know to what extent they are waiting, but even less that they are waiting in vain. Sometimes the awakening call, that chance event which gives permission to act, comes but too late, when the best part of youth and the strength to act has already been used up in sitting still. And how many a man has discovered to his horror when he rose up, that his limbs had gone to sleep, and it is too late, he has said to himself, having lost faith in himself and henceforth forever useless. Could it be that, in the realm of genius, Raphael without hands is, taking the phrase in its widest sense, not the exception but the rule? Perhaps genius is not so very rare. Perhaps what is rare is the 500 hands needed to tyrannize over the kairos, the right time to take chance by the forelock. He who does not want to see what is elevated in a man looks all the more keenly for what is low and foreground in him, and thereby gives himself away. In every kind of injury and loss, the lower and coarser soul is better off than the nobler. The dangers facing the latter are bound to be greater. The probability that it will come to grief and perish is, considering the multiplicity of the conditions of its life, enormous. When a lizard loses a finger, that finger grows again. Not so in the case of man. Annoying. The same old story. When one has finished one's house, one realizes that while doing so one has learnt unawares, something one absolutely had to know before one began to build. The everlasting pitiful, too late, the melancholy of everything finished. Wanderer, who are you? I see you go your way without scorn, without love, with unfathomable eyes, moist and sad as a sounding lead that has returned to the light unsated from every deep. What was it looking for down there? With a breast that does not sigh, with a lip that hides its disgust, with a hand which now reaches out but slowly. Who are you? What have you done? Repose here. This place is hospitable to everyone. Refresh yourself. And whoever you may be, what would you like now? What will refresh you? You have only to name it. Whatever I have I offer you. A refreshment. Refreshment. Oh, inquisitive man, what are you saying? But please give me, what? What? Say it one more mask. A second mask. Men of profound sorrow give themselves away when they are happy. They have a way of grasping happiness as if they wanted to crush and smother it. From jealousy, alas, they know too well that it will flee away. Bad. Bad. What? Is he not going backwards? Yes. But you ill understand him if you complain about it. He goes backwards, as everyone goes backwards who wants to take a big jump. Will they believe me? But I insist they believe me. I have always thought little of and about myself. Only in very rare instances have I done so, only when compelled, always without wanting to go in for it. Liable to digress from myself, never with any faith in the outcome, thanks to an unconquerable mistrust of they. There must be a kind of aversion in me to believing anything definite about myself. Is there perhaps a riddle concealed here? Probably, but fortunately one not for my own teeth. Does it perhaps betray the species to which I belong? But not to me, which suits me well enough. But whatever has happened to you? I don't know, he said, hesitating. Perhaps the harpies flew over my table. It sometimes happens today that a mild, moderate, reserved man suddenly breaks out into a rage, smashes the plates, throws the table over, screams, raves, insults everybody, and... Why? To starve all alone. To choke on his recollections. He who has the desires of an elevated, fastidious soul, and rarely finds his table laid and his food ready, will be in great danger at all times. But today the danger he is in has become extraordinary. Thrown into a noisy and plebeian age with which he has no wish to eat out of the same dish, he can easily perish of hunger and thirst, or, if he does eventually set to, of a sudden nausea. We have all no doubt eaten at tables where we did not belong, and precisely the most spiritual of us who are most difficult to feed know that dangerous dyspepsia which comes from a sudden insight and disappointment about our food and table companions, the after-dinner nausea. Supposing one wants to praise at all, it is a refined and at the same time noble piece of self-control to praise only where one does not agree, for in the other case one would be praising oneself, which is contrary to good taste, but it is a sort of self-control which offers a nice instigation, and if one is to be able to afford this real luxury of taste and morality, one has to live, not among blockheads of the spirit, but rather among people in whom misunderstandings and blunders are still amusing because of their subtlety, or one will have to pay dearly for it. He praises me, therefore he thinks I am right. This asinine conclusion spoils half the life of us hermits, for it makes asses come along to be our friends and neighbors. To live with a tremendous and proud self-possession, always beyond. To have and not have one's emotions, one's for and against, at will, to condescend to have them for a few hours. To seat oneself on them as on horses, often as on asses, for one has to know how to employ their stupidity as well as their fire. To keep one's 300 foregrounds, also one's dark glasses, for there are instances where no one may look into our eyes, still less into our grounds. And to choose for company that cheerful and roguish vice, politeness. And to remain master of one's four virtues, courage, insight, sympathy, solitude. For solitude is with us a virtue. It is a sublime urge and inclination for cleanliness which divines that all contact between man and man, in society, must inevitably be unclean. All community makes somehow, somewhere, sometime, common the greatest events and thoughts, but the greatest thoughts or the greatest events are comprehended last. The generations which are their contemporaries do not experience such events, they live past them. What happens here is similar to what happens in the realm of the stars. The light of the furthest stars comes to men last, and before it has arrived man denies that there are stars there. How many centuries does a spirit need to be comprehended? That too is a standard. With that too there is created an order of rank and etiquette such as is needed, for spirit and star. Here is the prospect free, the spirit exalted. But there is an opposite kind of man who is also on the heights, and for whom the prospect is also free, but who looks down. What is noble? What does the word noble mean to us today? What, beneath this heavy, overcast sky of the beginning rule of the rabble, which makes everything leaden and opaque, betrays and makes evident the noble human being? It is not his actions which reveal him. Actions are always ambiguous, always unfathomable. Neither is it his works. One finds today among artists and scholars sufficient who reveal by their works that they are driven on by a profound desire for the noble. But precisely this need for the noble is fundamentally different from the needs of the noble soul itself, and in fact, an eloquent and dangerous sign of its lack. It is not the works, it is the faith which is decisive here, which determines the order of rank here, to employ an old religious formula in a new and deeper sense. Some fundamental certainty which a noble soul possesses in regard to itself, something which may not be sought or found, and perhaps may. The noble soul has reverence for itself. There are people unavoidably possessed of spirit. Let them twist and turn how they may, and hold their hands before their treacherous eyes, as if the hand were not also a traitor. In the end, it always comes out that they have something they are hiding, namely spirit. One of the subtlest ways of deceiving, for as long as possible at any rate, and of successfully posing as more stupid than one is, which in everyday life is often as desirable as an umbrella, is called enthusiasm, plus what belongs with it, for example, virtue. For as Galliani, who ought to know, said, virtu est enthusiasmi. One always hears in the writings of a hermit something of the echo of the desert, something of the whisper and shy vigilance of solitude. In his strongest words, even in his cry, there still resounds a new and more dangerous kind of silence and concealment. He who has sat alone with his soul day and night, year in year out, in confidential discord and discourse, and in his cave, it may be a labyrinth, but it may be a gold mine become a cave bear or treasure hunter or a treasure guardian and dragon, finds that his concepts themselves at last acquire. The hermit does not believe that a philosopher, supposing that a philosopher has always been first of all a hermit, has ever expressed his real and final opinions in books. Does one not write books precisely to conceal what lies within us? Indeed, he will doubt whether a philosopher could have final and real opinions at all, whether behind each of his caves there does not and must not lie another, deeper cave, a stranger, more comprehensive world beyond the surface, an abyss behind every ground, beneath every foundation. Every philosophy is a foreground philosophy, that is a hermit's judgment. There is something arbitrary in the fact that he stopped, looked back, looked around here, that he stopped digging and laid his spade aside here. There is also something suspicious about it. Every philosophy also conceals. Every profound thinker is more afraid of being understood than of being misunderstood. The latter may perhaps wound his vanity, but the former will wound his heart, his sympathy, which says always, "Alas, why do you want to have as hard a time of it as I had?" Man, a manifold, mendacious, artificial, and untransparent animal, uncanny to the other animals less on account of his strength. From this point of view, there is perhaps much more in the concept art than is generally believed. A philosopher, a man who constantly experiences, sees, hears, suspects, hopes, dreams extraordinary things, who is struck by his own thoughts as if from without, as if from above and below, as by his kind of events and thunderclaps, who is himself perhaps a storm and pregnant with new lightnings. A philosopher, alas, a creature which often runs away from itself, is often afraid of itself, but which is too inquisitive not to keep coming to itself, again. A man who says, "I like this, I take it for my own and mean to protect it and defend it against everyone." A man who can do something, carry out a decision, remain true to an idea, hold on to a woman, punish and put down insolence. A man who has his anger and his sword, and to whom the weak suffer in. That pity has value. But of what account is the pity of those who suffer? Or, worse, of those who preach pity? There exists almost everywhere in Europe today a morbid sensitivity and susceptibility to pain, likewise a repellent intemperance in lamentation, a tenderization which, with the aid of religion and odds and ends of philosophy, would like to deck itself out as something higher. There exists a dowry. The unmanliness of that which is in such fanatic circles baptized, pity, is, I think, the first thing which leaps to the eye. This latest species of bad taste must be resolutely and radically excommunicated, and I would like to see the good amulet, Guy's saber, worn around neck and hearts so as to ward it off gay science, to make the matter plain. The Olympian vice, in spite of that philosopher who, being a real Englishman, sought to bring laughter into disrepute among all thinking minds. Laughter is a bad infirmity of human nature, which every thinking man will endeavor to overcome. Hobbes, I would go so far as to venture an order of R. And if gods too philosophize, as many an inference has driven me to suppose, I do not doubt that while doing so they also know how to laugh in a new and superhuman way, and at the expense of all serious things. Gods are fond of mockery. It seems they cannot refrain from laughter, even when sacraments are in progress. The genius of the heart as it is possessed by that great hidden one, the tempter god and born Pied Piper of consciences, whose voice knows how to descend into the underworld of every soul, who says no word and gives no glance in which there lies no touch of enticement, to whose mastery belongs no one. But what am I doing, my friends? Of whom am I speaking to you? Have I so far forgot myself that I have not even told you his name? Unless you have already yourselves divined who this questionable God and Spirit is who wants to be praised in such a fashion. For as happens to everyone who has always been on the move and in foreign lands from his childhood up, so many a strange and not undangerous spirit has crossed my path too. but above all he of whom I was just speaking, and he again and again, no less a personage in fact than the god Dionysus, that G. Meanwhile, I have learned much, all too much more about the philosophy of this god, and, as I have said, from mouth to mouth, I, the last disciple and initiate of the god Dionysus, and perhaps I might at last begin to give you, my friends, a little taste of this philosophy, in so far as I am permit. In a hushed voice, as is only proper, for it involves much that is secret, new, unfamiliar, strange, uncanny. The very fact that Dionysus is a philosopher, and that gods too therefore philosophize, seems a by no means harmless novelty, and one calculated to excite suspicion precisely among philosophers. Among you, my friends, it will meet with a friendlier reception, unless it comes too late and not at the. Perhaps I shall also have to go further in the frankness of my story than may always be agreeable to the strict habits of your ears. Certainly the above-named god went further, very much further, in conversations of this sort, and was always many steps ahead of me. Indeed, if it were permitted to follow the human custom of applying to him beautiful, solemn titles of pomp and virtue, I would have to extol his courage as investigator and discoverer, his daring honesty, truthfulness, and love of wisdom. But such a god has nothing to do with all this venerable lumber and pomp. Keep that, he would say, for yourself and your like and for anyone else who needs it. I have no reason to cover my nakedness. One will see that this species of divinity and philosopher is perhaps lacking in shame. Thus he once said, "Under certain circumstances I love mankind," alluding to Ariadne, who was present. "Man is to me an agreeable, brave, ingenious animal without equal on earth. He knows how to make his way through every labyrinth. I like him. I often ponder how I might advance him and make him stronger, more evil and more profound than he is." "Stronger, more evil and more profound?" I asked in alarm. "Yes," he repeated, "stronger, more evil and more profound, also more beautiful." And as he said that, the tempter god smiled his halcyon smile, as though he had just paid a charming compliment. Here one will also see that this divinity is lacking not only in shame, and there is in general good reason to suppose that in several respects the gods could all benefit from instruction by us human beings. We human beings are more humane. Alas, and yet what are you, my written and painted thoughts? It is not long ago that you were still so many-colored, young and malicious, so full of thorns and hidden spices you made me sneeze and laugh, and now. You have already taken off your novelty, and some of you, I fear, are on the point of becoming truths. They already look so immortal, so pathetically righteous, so boring. And has it ever been otherwise? For what things do we write and paint, we mandarins with Chinese brushes, we immortalizers of things which let themselves be written? What alone are we capable of painting? Alas, only that which is about to wither and is beginning to lose its fragrance. Alas, only storms departing exhausted and feelings grown old and yellow. Alas, only birds strayed and grown weary in flight who now let themselves be caught in our hand. We immortalize that which cannot live and fly much longer, weary and mellow things alone. And it is only your afternoon, my written and painted thoughts, for which alone I have the colors, many colors perhaps, many colored tendernesses and 50 yellows and browns and greens and reds. But no one will divine from these how you looked in your morning, you sudden sparks and wonder.